I've seen some amazing crochet projects recently, and I've always heard it's a fun and relaxing hobby while not being too hard to learn. So I'm putting that to the test and challenging myself to see how much I can learn in just 1 week. And I'm not going to stop there. My plan is to use whatever I learn throughout the week to hopefully make a finished project by the end before time runs out. I'm betting this entire video on the idea that I can learn this fairly quickly, so here we go. Day 1 started with a lot of trial and error and just learning the basics. So far, I've just gotten comfortable with the crochet motion by making this long cord. This ended up taking half the day, but really helped set the foundation for what I needed to understand. After giving my mind and hands a short break, I decided to start working on a small square to start understanding how to work back and forth. I didn't realize this at the time, but I wouldn't really be doing a whole lot of this type of pattern over the next week, but it was still really good practice. As you can see from this square, I was quickly learning some really valuable lessons about consistency. Lastly, for that day, I tried some other yarn, but it was a little too thick for the hook I had, and it was already late in the day, so I was just mentally drained and my hands were really sore, so I called it for day 1. For day 2, I still hadn't picked a larger goal to work towards, but I knew I'd eventually want to make something that was 3-dimensional. I had seen some images of stuffed animals and some really cool crochet creations made using a technique called amigurumi. So I knew that was a skill I needed to learn to use later on. But first I decided to run to the store to get some new yarn to test out this technique. It's so funny looking back on this because I thought this was one of maybe 2 trips that I would make to the store, and in the end I ended up going almost every single day. Anyways, I got some yarn to try making the sphere, and I also got some really thick yarn to just test out. After a couple hours, I successfully made a sphere, which was super exciting, but also had a lot of errors and was pretty rough. I ended up trying again, making a slightly smaller one, and it came out so much better. And I also gave him some eyes. But I learned so much from this, even though it took me most of the day just to make these 2 small spheres. For the rest of the afternoon and evening, I had to try out this thicker yarn. I first tried to make another sphere, but this yarn was so hard to work with, so I ended up undoing all of it. A quick side note, this is a really cool feature of crochet. Because you're working with just 1 string, if you want to undo something, you can pull that 1 string and just undo the whole thing. Or you can just undo the last few stitches you made if you make a mistake. That is assuming you catch it, which I didn't very often. Anyway, for the thick yarn, I ended up remaking it into this unfinished scarf type thing. I originally thought my big project might be using this type of yarn, but this had me rethinking everything because of how little I got out of it and just how difficult it was to work with. Day 3 arrived and I got a bit of a curveball. I came down with a pretty bad sickness, as you can probably hear, and it really took me out. To be fully transparent, I ended up taking a short break from this project to try and recover a bit. But I promise I didn't practice or learn anything related to crochet during that time. I still don't know what hit me, but I've been sick ever since. It's annoying. Anyway, at the start of day 3, I decided it was time to take on a project since it was already closing in on the halfway point. For that project, I wasn't quite sure what I should make. However, my wife and I have always wanted a dog, and we can't have one in our current apartment. So I found this jumbo-sized dog pattern on Etsy that would be the perfect thing to hold me over until I can get the real thing. The instructions looked really intimidating because it's essentially just a list of how many stitches to do in a specific sequence, and that results in a dog somehow. And all of these patterns on Etsy were like, these are not for beginners. But I guess I just thought I could figure it out. And I like a challenge. So I did another trip to a few stores to get the recommended supplies, and I ended up spending the entire rest of the day working on just 1 leg of the dog. And I didn't even finish that. This maybe should have been a sign that things weren't looking too good, but I figured I was still getting used to this new yarn. Plus, I ended up redoing the first stages of this leg like 4 or 5 different times. And this was the largest piece I had made up to this point by hundreds of stitches. So I still had some hope that things would speed up from here, but I did need to know if this would actually be doable. So I decided that for day 4, I would switch my entire focus to just the head of the dog, so that worst case scenario, I at least have something completed rather than just some various limbs. That would be a sad finale. Out of the gate, I worked as fast as I could on the dog's head, which was essentially a massive sphere. At the widest point, I was making 160 stitches for every round. For perspective, on day 1, just that would have taken me probably 2 or 3 hours to do, and I was now doing that in like 20 minutes. Probably still incredibly slow, but making huge improvements. By the end of the day, I had completed roughly half of the sphere, which was discouraging. It took me almost 8 hours, which means it would probably take all of day 5 to just finish it. And that's just the base. There's so many additional components to add to it. On top of all of that, it just wasn't looking right. I wasn't sure if I was missing stitches or just making mistakes along the way, but it was just looking really off. And I definitely had a major fear that this whole project would turn into one of those crochet disasters that I had seen so many pictures of online. For being a complete beginner, this was looking like a huge possibility. So I took a second to just step back and reflect. Each day I learned small things, but looking at the whole picture, it was amazing to see the progression I made over each day and how much I had really accomplished. I realized I had learned a lot, but maybe speed was something that just came with time, and I should focus on things like technique instead. I originally thought making something big would really show off how much I learned over these 7 days, but maybe something slightly smaller but more intricate would be just as impressive. So all that work from day 3 and 4 was useless. Day 5, I knew I needed to get a move on, and I started by buying a new dog pattern and even more yarn. This was a bit risky, but I decided to stick with the yarn I had been using for the previous project, even though the new one called for a much thinner yarn. I had just gotten really used to working with this yarn, and I just hoped that everything would scale proportionally. Plus, it's just so soft. Anyway, I learned my lesson from the last attempted project, and I started with the head first, and I successfully got through the entire thing with time to spare. I started working on the torso section next, since that was another large section, and by the end of the day I also completed the ears and nose, rounding out what I would call a very successful day. Day 6 was arguably even more successful. I did have to run to the store again to get more yarn colors, and after working on some arms to decide if I wanted red or blue for the shirt color, I continued on with the torso. I also made a tail, finished the second arm, and even made some accessories. But I had everything done and ready to be assembled on the final day. This was a very different day than all the others. I took my time and slowly stitched up all the pieces. And then before I knew it, it was complete. So this is Benny. My wife named him that the second I showed him to her, but I am just so happy with how he turned out. Of course, being a beginner, there are tons of errors and plenty of things that I totally messed up on, but each part of Benny tells a story of the things that I learned throughout this project. I do thoroughly enjoy crocheting at this point, but I can't say I recommend really long days of it back to back. I hope you enjoyed the journey, and make sure to check out some of my other crazy projects on my channel. I think that's pretty much it for this project, but I will see you in the next one.